Welcome to Elizabeth's Chronicles. If you love true crime, consider subscribing. George Emil Banks was born in 1942. He was a mixed-race child, born to an African-American father and a white mother. He grew up in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, where the population was 80% white. From an early age, he experienced racism. This affected George even into his adult years. When George was 17, he joined the army. He was hoping to make it a career, but due to disagreements with his superiors he was discharged only 2 years later. In 1961 George was arrested, and convicted of armed robbery, for robbing a store in South Scranton. He and a friend shot the store owner in the robbery, wounding him. He served 8 years, and was released back into society in 1969. He married an African-American woman, which resulted in 2 children, but the two divorced in 1976. When this relationship ended in disaster, George decided he would only date white women. By the start of 1982, he had purchased a home in Wilkes-Barre and had 3 younger white women living with him. The women were living on the street. He offered them a roof over their heads. He was having a relationship with all 3 women, and had 4 children among them. The women living with him were Dorothy Lyons, age 29, Regina Clemens, age 29, and Susan Uhos, age 23. George also had a 5-year-old son with his ex-girlfriend, Sharon Mazzillo, who lived in her own home just 4 miles away. The relationship with Sharon had not ended well. The two were in a custody battle. George had been given parental responsibility of their child, but Sharon disobeyed the court order, and was keeping the child with her, and refused to return him to George. After leaving prison in 1969, George had changed his ways. He had no more criminal activities since, and kept a job. He never kept the same job too long, but he was steadily employed. In 1980 he was employed with Camp Hill State Correctional Facility as a prison guard. However, he had been placed on medical leave, and they had referred him to a mental health clinic, due to his behavior at the prison. He was making threats that he was going to kill his children, and himself. On September 25, in 1982 George spent the night before drinking heavily, and taking prescription drugs. Early in the morning, he dressed in full military combat clothing, then he shot and killed the 3 women living with him, and one by one, killed all 5 children living in the home. 4 of the children were his own biological children, one was Dorothy Lyons' daughter from a previous relationship, Nancy Lyons, age 11. When he stepped outside, there was 2 men leaving their home across the street, so he shot both men. 34-year-old Ray Hall was killed instantly. 22-year-old Jimmy Olsen survived. Banks drove to his ex-girlfriend's home, Sharon Mazzillo. He forced his way into her home, shot and killed her, and their 5-year-old son, Kismayu Banks. He then shot Sharon's 7-year-old nephew, Scott Mazzillo, and her mother, Alice Mazzillo. Sharon's younger brothers were also in the home, but when they heard the initial shots, they hid under a bed. The boys called the police as soon as it was safe. George then went to his mother's home, where he made a full confession to his mother. She drove him to a friend's house, Jacob Witt, where he would have a standoff with police. He refused to give up. After several hours of negotiating with George, a former colleague was able to get him to turn himself in. It ended with no gunfire. Psychiatrists interviewed George after the murders. He said there was a conspiracy against him, overwhelming his thoughts. Dr. Michael Spodak said, "In my opinion he was completely irrational. He had lost touch with reality on a great many things. He said he thinks someone moved the bodies around, and put extra bullets into them, and changed some of the clothes. They were not rational expressions. That's part of his illness. Dr. Spodak said that George Banks was terminally paranoid, and not competent to stand trial. However, another psychiatrist, Dr. Robert Sadorf, testified at the pre-trial hearing, that George Banks understood the charges against him. The judge agreed, and ruled that Banks was legally competent to stand trial. The jury for George Banks was selected from over 260 miles away, due to it being heavily talked about in the media. The trial began on June 6, in 1983 at Luzerne County Courthouse in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Against his attorney's suggestions, George Banks demanded he testify in his own trial. Banks' attorneys argued that he was a disturbed man, who was paranoid with a focus on a delusional race war he felt was coming. They claimed he was suffering from paranoia psychosis at the time of the murders. And a psychiatrist testified for the defense, that Banks believed a white police officer actually committed the murders. While on the stand, Banks said if they'd let him exhume the bodies, he could prove that the police murdered the victims, not him. He claims he had merely wounded them, and the white police officer came in later and murdered them all. At the trial, the two children who hid at Sharon Mazilow's home, testified how they saw Banks shoot their mother, sister and nephew. George Banks' mother, friends, and co-workers all testified that Banks had grew up coping with racism, and it had terribly affected him. His mother felt that the racism had changed him, leaving him with deep resentment toward both races. The prosecution had ex-girlfriends testify how he abused them in the past. On June 21, 1983, George Banks was found guilty on all 12 counts of first-degree murder, and 1 count of third-degree murder, attempted murder, aggravated assault and robbery, theft, and endangering the life of another person. The jury recommended the death sentence the next day. Banks' attorneys filed multiple appeals maintaining he did not have the mental competency to be executed. During this time, Banks tried to commit suicide numerous times. He even went on a hunger strike, where he eventually had to be force-fed in order to keep him alive. His execution date has been set twice, but stayed both times. In 2010 it was ruled that he was not competent to be put to death. He was transferred to SCI Phoenix to live out the remainder of his life. He is currently in his 70s. During his last hearing he said he was willing to die because it would deliver his soul back to the Lord. Jose Antonio Suarez, aka Jose Torres, was from Puerto Rico. He was a laundry worker. His common-law wife, Maria Torres, age 24, had 4 kids with Suarez, and another child, Harry, the oldest, age 5, from a previous relationship. The couple lived in a 6-story apartment building at the corner of South 5th Street in Brooklyn. The couple had a rocky relationship, and had separated several times, but would end up back together. Suarez has a history of mental illness, and had spent 6 weeks in Kings Park State Hospital in Long Island for a suicide attempt. On a Saturday night in April of 1966, the couple went to a movie together. Marie's mother, who lives in the same building, Mrs. Victoria Torres, age 59, watched the children so they could enjoy time together. After the movie, the couple picked up the children, and went to their apartment. Shortly after, an elderly woman saw the couple kissing in the doorway of their apartment. Not long after, at 11:30 p.m. Jose stabbed Marie to death with a butcher knife. He then stabbed each child, killing everyone in the home. The bodies were found in the couple's 4-room, 2nd-floor apartment Wednesday at around 5 p.m. after the murders, by the building superintendent, Crescencio Irizarry. They were all dressed for bed. Maria was found on the floor of one of the bedrooms. On the bed lay her 11-month-old baby, Jose Jr. In the second bedroom, was a set of bunk beds. In each bed they found 2 children. They were Harry, age 5, Yvette, age 4, Maria Antoinette, age 3, and Nancy, age 2. All died of stabbed wounds. Hundreds of people gathered at the scene, behind police lines as investigators arrived at the scene. Suarez was found walking the streets in the Williamsburg area of Brooklyn, which is the same area of the apartment building. Suarez confessed to the killings, and signed a sworn statement. He said he and his wife argued. The argument led to his wife accidentally cutting him, so he took the knife, and stabbed her to death, then killed the children. He was indicted on the murders of his wife Marie, and all 5 children. Only 49 days later, despite the confession, José Suarez was set free. He was not read his Miranda rights. Even an animal such as this one, and I believe this is an insult to the animal kingdom, must be protected with all the legal safeguards, said State Supreme Court Justice Michael Kern, when dismissing the case. He went on to say, "This is a very sad thing. It is so repulsive it makes one's blood run cold, and any decent human being's stomach turn to let a thing like this out on the street." At the time of Suarez's arrest, New York state law did not require that an accused man be advised on the points outlined by the Supreme Court's decision, so he was not advised. However, laws were changed, and it became law that the accused has to be read their Miranda rights, and then they retroactively covered all defendants who had not been tried yet. Therefore, José Antonio Suarez was set free. His current whereabouts are unknown. George Emil Banks was a deeply disturbed man who snapped, murdering 13 innocent people. He should have never been released from the mental hospital in the first place. José Antonio Suarez murdered his entire family due to an argument, then was set free due to not being read his Miranda rights. This is a tragic case, where the system has failed innocent victims. When this law was changed, it should have never been set to be retroactive. Someone who murders their entire family should never be set free to do it again. That concludes this episode. Keep your eye out for the next episode, coming soon. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing. Thanks for watching.